Well, yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's a huge subject. So I'm like both excited to talk about it and a little bit, overwhelmed and intimidated. So to put myself into some kind of context, as your audience might already know, my name is Simukai Chigudu. I'm an associate professor of African politics over in the Oxford Department of International Development, and I also hold a governing body fellowship at St. Anthony's College. Now, my route into the social sciences was somewhat circuitous. I moved to the UK from Zimbabwe as an international student. And after completing my A-levels in this country, I actually went to medical school at Newcastle University in the northeast of England. And for about 6 years while I was a student, I felt like I was inhabiting at least two very different worlds. I was learning about clinical practice very much within the context of, the demographic needs and challenges and demands of being in the northeast of England, on the one hand, and at the same time, I had a desire or a passion or an interest in ultimately taking those skills back to the African context from which I had emanated. And I think during the course of my studies, I found it quite difficult to fully make sense of, where medicine and my career and my interest in Africa might all fit together. So through a series of, internships, mini research projects, and a quite formative clinical experience in South Africa, I think I began to feel like I was rubbing up against the limits of what clinical medicine could do in Africa. So to sort of distill this down to one anecdote, I was working out in rural South Africa back in 2008 in a really deprived hospital. And, you would go in, there's huge queues of patients, pregnant women coming in with full-blown eclampsia, something that we're told in the UK we would never see in our careers, patients fitting with cryptococcal meningitis in the waiting room, folks with, axes hanging from parts of their limbs. And I remember reading at that time a quote from a South African journalist who said, shelve the abiding fiction that disasters don't discriminate, that they flatten everything in their path with democratic disregard. Plagues zero in on the dispossessed, on those forced to build their lives in the paths of danger. And I think for me, that quote kind of distilled an inchoate desire to situate what I was seeing clinically within some kind of larger structural or historical framework. So that took me when I graduated and had completed my foundation training into public health. And I found public health was an awkward fit for me. It brought me closer to some of the big picture questions I was interested in asking, but still operated with a kind of epidemiological blinker, blind to questions of political economy, cultural pluralism, and historical contingency. And so I eventually left the field of medicine altogether, came to Oxford, where I read for a master's in African studies that turned into a doctorate. And at a kind of dizzying rate, I moved from being a master's student to a doctoral student to a departmental lecturer to an associate professor, all the while pursuing studies thinking about the politics of epidemics and global health in Africa. And as we will discuss, getting drawn into a wider debate about who produces what kind of knowledge and what does it really mean to decolonize university.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, something that's very much in the public consciousness, this idea of disasters that don't discriminate, with the COVID pandemic, seeing that people were vulnerable to different extents in terms of contracting and the severity of the experience of COVID-19 as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was wondering, from your perspective, especially working in the Oxford Department of International Development, can you give us a brief overview of how knowledge production on Africa has historically emerged along racial lines?
Yeah, okay, so this is a question that is quite literally impossible to answer within the framework that we have. But okay. I'm going to try and cheat here a little bit and say, okay, right. Knowledge production of Africa. vast, expansive terrain. How far back in time do we go? What forms of kind of, civilization, what modalities of kind of writing, storytelling, oral history, and so on would we put together? I think for our purposes, what might be illustrative is thinking very much about the formal, and if you like, modern constitution of African studies as an interdisciplinary arena of scholarship, right? So if we were to just go back, say, to the 20th century and begin to say, well, at what point did we start to train and certify people as specialists who study Africa? When did we start to create university departments and centers, learned societies, journals, publications, prizes, all of the paraphernalia that create a kind of recognized scholarly field? And I think with respect to African studies, we would probably find at least 4 different traditions, right? So since we're speaking in England, we might think about the British tradition of African studies, which is, inseparable from its colonial history. Many of the original, British centers of African studies within, on this island were partnered with or evolved from colonial institutions that had been set up in Africa, whether that's the British Institute of East Africa, the Rift Valley Institute, so on and so forth. Now, those institutions have evolved in purpose, but they were fundamentally tied to the expansion of colonialism on the continent and the imperative to try to kind of understand and master an array of social and historical phenomena. Everything from understanding, the, if you like, anthropology of kind of customs, the organization of political and cultural authority, Africans' relationship with their natural environment, all of that kind of thing. Another tradition we might look towards is in the United States. And in the United States, we sort of have a bifurcated tradition, bifurcated along racial lines. So there is a long history of African Americans who inhabit an idea of a kind of diasporan intellectual culture, seeking to make sense of the Black experience globally. And yet that tradition has never quite hit the mainstream of elite American academia. It hasn't received the same level of federal funding, for instance, as perhaps did mainstream, African studies within elite American universities in the middle to the latter half of the 20th century. And that was mostly run by white scholars, both appropriating and excluding Black scholars from the study of Africa. And you have, one of the founding figures in the discipline, Melville Herskovits, writing in the middle of the 20th century that Americans are privileged by their position. Of course, Americans here taken to mean white male Americans are privileged in their position for the study of Africa because, unlike their British counterparts, they are not encumbered by the processes of empire and decolonization that were taking place at the time that he was writing. And unlike African Americans, they are not encumbered by the parochialism of racial identity and affinity, right? So you have these 2 traditions. And I should have said earlier that when we look at the British tradition of African studies, crudely put, the racial dynamic plays out such that Africans play the role of like data gatherers. They do the labor on the ground or on the field. But when it comes to the more analytical or conceptual work, the refinement, that happens usually by white British scholars, right? So there's a kind of analogy here between knowledge production and like material resource extraction, manufacturing, and refinement, right? It's not a perfect analogy, but it's helpful to think with. Okay, so a 4th tradition that we might look to is continental African studies, right? The history of scholars within Africa trying to produce knowledge about their own social realities. And this is another, fraught history that has gone through many different cycles that we can, discuss in bits and pieces in this conversation. But by way of preview, we might ask ourselves, well, what role did African intellectuals play in the histories of nationalism and independence in the continent? Or, how did, say, the debt crisis and subsequent structural adjustment to neoliberalism play in restructuring higher education on the continent? Why have historically there been so many struggles for advancing an agenda of, academic freedom within Africa, and how have those been frustrated. And for instance, how have African scholars either been complicit with or silenced by military authoritarian regimes in different parts of the continent's history, right? So that's a totally different concern. But what's striking is that that tradition does not hold, barely has a foothold in the vast amount of social scientific publishing that comes out about the continent, right? So if we're to look at the early 21st century, 99% of all scientific and social scientific publication about Africa comes from outside of the continent. And in that remaining 1%, right, most of that scholarship comes from just 3 countries, Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa, with only a tiny amount being produced by women. Okay, so the history of race, as well as other markers of social identity, is woven into, it's baked into, it is fundamental to the very trajectory of African studies as a scholarly interdiscipline.
Wow, absolutely fascinating. So many questions. Yeah, so I think just to follow up on that, I mean, to what extent do you think there is sort of acknowledgement of this history, the colonial legacies, the bifurcation in the US, and the role that, the international community has played on supporting or silencing African scholars? Yeah, how much do you think that that's acknowledged currently in knowledge production on Africa, perhaps in non-African institutions? I would.
Yeah. So just to be slightly difficult here, I might complicate your use of the term international community.
Okay.
Of course, what we're trying to grapple with is, when we say international community, are we thinking about the global Black experience, or are we using that as a shorthand for white Western scholars, and who gets to have a monopoly on that particular designation? And then, of course, we have like the interchange of people, through different parts of the world involved in the study of Africa. Nevertheless, I take your point at a structural level. So the acknowledgement question, I guess, an obvious kind of point of departure for this question is to think about the sorts of cultural politics and modalities of activism that have been quite prevalent in higher education, over the last decade or so. So what obviously springs to mind are things like the Rhodes Must Fall protests that began in South Africa in 2015. They, of course, spilt over to our university in Oxford. I was a part of that movement, or at least at its foundation. And there is a pressing demand within, just looking narrowly at this last decade or so, kind of pressing demand to, decolonize knowledge production, to think about, who gets to be, or to think about, if you like, the body politic of a university, right? What does the student body look like? And how representative is it of wider demographics? Those questions might be inverted in the UK and in South Africa, but they're no less salient for that fact. What does the faculty look like? What forms of history, of literature, of philosophy, or of science broadly conceived are canonized in pedagogy, or are seen as foundational to, research agendas across the disciplines, right? So I think these are some of the questions that were raised in the fallist movements, or in this, decolonization kind of activist politics. And, speaking from a personal perspective, being involved in Rhodes Must Fall, at the time and its foundation, there was something very exciting about it, and it felt, in its own small way, a bit like a mini revolution. It felt necessary and urgent and vital and true. And at the same time, these are not new debates, so it's tempting to think that something is afoot, that we're at a kind of moment, to use that phrase, where there is a kind of reckoning with race and racism in the academy, and with these complicated or difficult histories. Okay, Rhodes Must Fall, decolonization, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, all of that kind of stuff. But what taking, this hyper immediate view of things kind of misses out is the much longer standing and quite cyclical nature of some of these debates. Right? So I'd alluded earlier about some of the concerns around academic freedom in Africa. So to take the year 1990 as an example, there was a big meeting in Kampala called for the Declaration of Academic Freedom in Africa. And many of the iconic figures of African studies from Mahmoud Mamdani, Mamadou Diop, Amina Mama, and so on, are involved in this conversation that's trying to reckon very seriously with the crisis that's engulfing the continent at that particular moment in history. You know, pressing concerns about the economy and austerity in the world of neoliberal globalization, pressing concerns about the precarious battle for democracy and the remaining outposts of white supremacist states in Southern Africa. You know, so these debates are going on at that time and trying to identify what it might mean to have a meaningful African academy. But they're also happening elsewhere. You know, in the United States around that time, you have the distinguished professor of history at Johns Hopkins, Philip Curtin, writing that American universities tending towards hiring more Black faculty, assistant professors in the field of history, are effectively ghettoizing the discipline of history. By trying to make it more Black, they are structurally excluding white scholars from the study of history and turning the field into something kind of parochial and inward looking. There was a whole debate in the Chronicle of Higher Education about that. Curtin went on to say that, you know, these trends, kind of like anxiety about political correctness, was a form of intellectual apartheid, right? So you have that set of debates there. We can keep going back in time. This has been going on for a long time. There is a kind of mimetic and recursive quality to these debates. It's a little bit like being stuck in a bad video game where you just can't get past level 2. And each time your character dies, you go right back to the beginning, wiping the slate blank as if none of that effort had happened before. So as much as I want to say that we're, you know, at an exciting kind of moment of reckoning, I would also caution that, you know, we've been here before. And so a tougher question becomes, well, what's the cumulative effect of this kind of work? And is this a cycle that carries on, you know, in perpetuity, or are there opportunities for deeper, more structural change?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we'll come on to that, I think. But just to follow up on what you said, because obviously your role in University of Oxford situates you quite well to work with lots of different researchers. And I was wondering if you could comment on how you've observed knowledge production processes differing or producing different sort of outputs among white and Black scholars.
I mean, there are not many Black scholars in Oxford. You know, so I think there has been a concerted effort fruit. You know, so my colleagues in the African Studies Center, you know, have hired Black professors. They're also thinking a lot about gender. But, you know, this is really, on the grand scheme of things, quite small stuff. I think that the way we're teaching students, at least in the areas that I'm a part of, so in development studies and adjacent fields, there has been a solid impression left by, you know, the demands of roads must fall, or indeed our current awareness about racial politics, to try to think, well, actually, let's, you know, think a bit more deeply about what the curriculum looks like and what stories we sort of privilege in the telling of social science. So I think that is happening. And it's encouraging in many ways. And, you know, there are other examples to some extent in the history faculty. I know there's been a number of discussions in the politics department about how PPE is put together. You know, in terms of research, for instance, I mean, a lot of the work that I do is quite individual. But just observing the landscape as it shifts, you know, my department is starting to think and to revise its model for how ethical clearance is granted from projects to, you know, factor in these questions of partnership versus extractivism, for instance, of collaboration rather than exploitation, and trying to normalize the idea that these are important questions that we can be asking. And then you see it, of course, in editorial boards of how journals are put together and so on. So there is some stuff that's happening. How fundamental it is, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I think it's the stuff that should be happening. I think it needs to happen. I'm less convinced that it changes, the marrow of, how all of this stuff works.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking about is there seem to be a huge number of different initiatives that I know of across Oxford University, but to decolonize curriculums, to bring in anti-racist policies and practices, but they tend to be led by white academics and white administrators. And I wonder whether you think that is, what your opinion is on that.
I mean, so partly it's a structural problem, right? That they're just not enough. They're just not enough people of color in the university. There are not enough Black people in university, right? So you end up in, I'll take this opportunity to say that this is probably the last talk I'm going to give on this topic for at least, well, actually indefinitely. And that's because if you start talking about this stuff, it can, you can get a bit pigeonholed or stuck doing it and having to do it all of the time. And that can also feel like a limiting role. So I'm quite sympathetic to some of my colleagues who think, I can't, some of my Black colleagues, for instance, who think, I can't do this. I can't speak at yet another thing to do with race. So I can't, and so there is that dilemma, right? So who's going to do that work? I think that there's like an important dimension to this to sort of say that like, well, if we are thinking about changing the university, if we are thinking very, rigorously and conscientiously and with stamina and sustained effort about whatever term you want to use, decolonization, diversity, et cetera, the buzzword changes, that's got to be everybody's business, and so, yeah, white scholars have a specific and demanding role to be played in that. But of course, the danger with that is it just becomes a way of appeasing or satisfying a certain, level of kind of cultural liberalism that just goes along with the tide and doesn't do anything kind of radical or transformative. So fundamentally, it's a structural problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So to move on away from this a bit, you are currently writing a book called When Will We Be Free? Living in the Shadow of Empire and the Struggle for Decolonization. I was wondering if you can tell the audience a bit about what to expect from this work.
Sure. So I should give this a little bit of context. So the book, or the project, I guess it started with a desire to try to concentrate and focus and really push my own thinking about some of these decolonization debates to their limit, or to my own limits, and really tried to sink my teeth in it, because I feel like over the last several years I've done lots of bits and pieces of writing, debating, discussion, and so on, and I really wanted to have sustained work on this topic. But as I started to think about the book and how I might put it together, it was harder and harder to separate my analytical or political or sociological analysis from a topic that hews so closely to the bones of my experience. And so I think it's evolved from being something about decolonization as a thing out there to a much more intimate story about what it's been like for me and for my family to live through and live in the aftermath of colonialism, particularly in Southern and East Africa, and for me as a migrant in Britain. So the arc of the book is that it's going to trace my family's involvement in anti-colonial struggles through the latter half of the 20th century. For instance, tracking closely my father's enrollment and participation in the national liberation struggle against the white supremacist Rhodesian state that then became the independent, Zimbabwean nation. His time in exile in Uganda, where he met my mother, the pair of them living under the draconian rule of Idi Amin, who had learned who received his education in repression from the British. And so their stories tell and illustrate different kinds of legacies of empire in Africa. But even as I grew up in Zimbabwe, the education I received, the common sense notions about what race is and how it works, so much about the customs and the culture, the set of expectations were shaped by colonialism and its aftermath. And then, of course, coming from Zimbabwe, the onset of the crisis in the country in 2000, the kind of convulsion with Mugabe's reclamation over white commercially owned farmland is itself an unresolved colonial legacy. And yet, coming to Britain, I see a totally different and inverted image where the history of empire is reflected through distance and nostalgia, something often fated and celebrated, or at least dimly understood as, you know, part of the great legacy of the country, but that happened a long time ago. And so I want to tell a story about how colonialism is this thing that's very, very big, but that's also very, very personal. You know, that it's not just about politics and history, it's also something that affects one's heart and one's mind, one's sense of home and of belonging, and the ability to be able to tell one's own story. And so the question, when will we be free, is a reckoning both at a societal level, at a philosophical level, if you like, but of course, it's partly me thinking for myself, what would it mean for me to live my own life free of this really complicated inheritance that I feel has trailed me, you know, in every institution I've been a part of and in every step along my own journey.
It sounds wonderful, and I can't wait to read it. Yeah. And I'm just really taken by your personal reflexivity and how you managed to interweave that with your scholarly approach. And I think it's really important and really inspiring. So thank you for that.
That's very kind of you to say.
So as an academic myself, who studies development in Ethiopia and Kenya, especially as a white British woman, I spend quite a lot of time reflecting on these issues and especially thinking about the ethics of the work that I do. And perhaps to help me and other early career professionals in the room, what are the top 3 pieces of practical advice that you would give us to be more conscious, to have more conscious engagement with the epistemological roots of African studies and with our work on knowledge production in Africa?
So, you know, as I was thinking and as I started working on the book in 2020, and then I'm taking a year off next academic year to, you know, dive into it deeply and to finish it. I decided in this journey that my book is going to be a meditation and not a manifesto, and that I really want to dwell in discomfort for a time, discomfort in confronting my own past before trying to move towards resolution or solutions. And I think that journey is starting to reflect in so much else of how I think about, you know, my role as a scholar, a teacher, the position I play in the academy. And so I've spent, you know, a lot of time at conferences and at other arenas kind of thinking about, well, okay, practically, what do we do about like the decolonization agenda, or trying to instruct my students, you know, how do you study Africa in a more kind of ethical and practical way and so on. But you've caught me at a moment where I feel that right now that's not the best role for me to be playing, partly for myself because I do want to reflect and to think, and partly because I'm perhaps more interested in what you would have to say about that question. You know, I mean, I'm not the lodestar or the guiding light on this, and I don't have the answers. I know, or I'm trying very hard to reckon with myself in my own particular, you know, set of social circumstances and moment in historic time, and that's kind of made me a bit more reticent to say, well, this is how it should be done. So I guess what would be your reflections on this? What advice perhaps would you dole out for yourself or for other people in your position?
I think it's a really good question, and Yeah, I think if you ask me tomorrow, I'll probably tell you a different answer than I would tell you today, because it's a constant cycle of back and forth and thinking about things in different ways. But yeah, hopefully we can catch up with you after you finished your book and maybe see if you have any additional thoughts on that or not. But great, thank you so much for the invitation and the conversation. And yeah, we'll go to the audience now and see if there's any questions.
Great, thank you.
What an absolute privilege to speak with Dr. Simukai Chigudu. I can see Ellie's been keeping me up to date with the chat. So I'm going to go straight over to Simukai and ask him to follow up on his comment to Dorothy about why he's opted out of engaging or commenting on the recent ASR controversy. I think that might be a good place to start. So over to you, Simukai.
I mean, it's sort of a good place to start, except that I don't know if people are aware of what's happened. I can only give the most schematic outline because, as I've said, I've sort of opted out of it. But a pair of researchers, I think both of them white women, I think American, had a paper published in African Studies Review about autoethnography. And so they were kind of contemplating the use of autoethnography as concept and as methodology within African studies and how it might be wielded by white scholars specifically to have a more productive engagement with African studies. It's caused a lot of controversy because it's kind of been seen as quite self-indulgent. There was also a lot of ethical questions raised about how they've approached it. And for many scholars, they think they kind of totally missed the mark and reproduced a lot of things that are wrong with how a lot of white scholars think about Africa anyway, as a kind of site for their own self-actualization or emotional fulfillment or something like that. I haven't read the paper. I know that there have been a number of petitions to have it revoked. I know that it's angered a lot of people. For me personally, I'm trying to think of the polite way of putting this. I guess it just hasn't really held interest to me. It's just not really felt like an interesting discussion. It's also just felt like it doesn't come at the right time for me to sink my teeth into. As I kind of stated in the talk, and I'm going deeper, reckoning with my own sense of fragmented personal history and identity and situating that in constant and relentless dialogue with the structural and social circumstances that have shaped it, I feel okay saying, you know what, some of the major currents in academia might need to go to one side for a bit while I do this kind of work.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thank you so much for explaining that, because I wasn't aware of it. So I'm sure there are others in the audience who weren't as well. So I'm going to go straight to Melvin's question now, who says that African governments invest less than 1% of their budgets in research. If African governments invested more, I think this would increase the output of African researchers based at African institutions. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, so Melvin sort of asks and answers to his own question because, you know, this would partly address the problem, but I mean, gosh, there are just so many different layers that would need to be addressed. I mean, there's that sheer kind of material dimension to it, you know, the financial support that's given to universities. Then there are things about the day-to-day work of many African academics. I think it's, you know, not an unfair generalization to say a lot of top African scholars on the continent, not only are they poorly remunerated, but often are teaching, you know, massive classes, often rely on consultancy contracts with Western institutions to stay afloat, end up in partnerships that are, you know, unequal, struggle to get the same level of recognition in top journals outside. There's just like a host of problems. And I think funding could just be like one small part of addressing just an array of these sorts of issues. And I think some of the anger and the resentment, for instance, that came out in the fallist movements, is rooted with deep frustrations about how higher education is failing to facilitate social mobility, for instance, for many first-generation scholars. So, that's also an issue. It's quite daunting when we think about what it would take to kind of rework some of these dynamics. Something I like to think more about, but yeah, really quite difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark's asked, he said, really interesting analysis, although you appear Anglo-centric with your readings. You made no mention of the African-French Negritude approach, and I wondered why you haven't mentioned any other non-English language traditions or academies.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few reasons why I haven't. It's a little bit out of my expertise. I mean, part of my involvement in this debate has been an organic evolution. When I started, my graduate studies in African studies, my primary focus was on the politics of epidemics, particularly in Zimbabwe to begin with. And it's kind of just being within the field and becoming aware of a bunch of racial and structural dynamics that troubled me, was how I got involved in activism, and then later on began to think about how the particular province of academia that I occupy came to be what it is. Now, of course, I couldn't hope to do justice to the sheer range and scale and complexity of colonialism in Africa and its impact on knowledge production, certainly not in a forum like this, and certainly not with much more extensive research. But what I was hoping to illustrate in the talk was to say, well, if we latch on to that narrow set of examples from within the English-speaking world, we can start to pull out a number of different themes and trends that I think would warrant independently a lot of their own exploration.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we've got a question here from Elliot, who says, North Atlantic universities and think tanks celebrate their influence on African policy processes as a metric of success in their research, which is in direct opposition to the growth of a healthy evidence ecosystem in African countries. How can we meaningfully or materially pressure Northern institutions to substantively support research production in African countries, given these incentives?
Oh God. I mean, I think the word ecosystem is kind of helpful here, because that speaks to a complex kind of topography of different kinds of institutions and individuals working to a myriad array of ends. And I don't think, I mean, I think a lot of the attempts to influence policy processes and the kind of metrics that are used, we could work within those logics and think, well, okay, how does shifting money from one bit to another, or what models of collaboration might make this work more effectively? But I think something more radical, which then becomes very difficult to do, is to even question that enterprise at its root. What kinds of policy processes are being advanced? I mean, a lot of scholarship, a lot of work on Africa, particularly in the social sciences, does work from the kind of foundational premise that Africa is in need of being developed, right? That there is some form of deficit that needs to be addressed, an array of problems that need to be solved. Now, I'm not at all trying to deny that there are very substantial, very significant problems within Africa. But I am trying to say that, who sets up those foundational assumptions, what kinds of problems become identified, what model of development then follows, who sets those kinds of agendas. I mean, these are really difficult questions. And I guess maybe something else that strikes me is we have to, or we're sort of compelled in the North Atlantic world, to use that phrase, to think with the category of Africa. And I'm not always sure how helpful that is in a kind of material sense. So I think that we're lumping together a lot of complexity. And I guess this kind of goes into the earlier question about why I've talked about the English-speaking world rather than, say, the French or Portuguese speaking parts of Africa. And it's kind of like, well, you have a category that is so expansive and elastic and constantly shifting with so many different things going on that you get a little bit stuck And that can give way to a kind of parsimony and pragmatism that says, well, let's just do this and make this little thing better. And I think that that's where a lot of like the work around kind of metrics and policy ends up landing. And so I guess there's the more immediate question of making those processes better, and the much harder question of like rewriting all of this from scratch.
Yeah, and I guess in follow up to that, in terms of who makes the rules and who sets the agenda, Marina's asked, what is your opinion on knowledge outputs and high standard journals that are strongly rooted in Western academic traditions?
So there's a really interesting paper published in 1981 in the Comparative Studies of Society and History by Karl Pletsch. And it's a kind of intellectual history of the evolution of the social sciences and how they track very closely to the emergence of the kind of three world division that existed during the Cold War, the First World, Second World, and Third World. And Pletsch's kind of claim is that we can't understand how the social sciences evolved separate from a kind of division of labor that was created. So if Western societies or the First World represents the kind of forefront, the teleological forefront of where human societies are going, they can be studied according to the laws of social science. So political science, sociology, economics as the kind of primary colors of social science, then, you know, like study politics, economy and society in the Western world. Then everything else is modulated or inflected by a form of like parochial wisdom, you know. So area studies departments emerge, borrowing from the social sciences and languages and history to make sense of the Second World, the Soviet world and Eastern Europe. And then African studies then is like something else altogether with a lot more anthropology. And so you have this like, so I think a lot of those traditions are conditioned by this. So in my own theoretical discipline, at least, political science, the top scholarly journals, with their commitment to, you know, the scientific production of knowledge about politics, adhere to quite a narrow and very formal, very quantitative methodological kind of standard for like how you do political science, one that often resembles economics. What that means is that a lot of the numerate techniques that you need to do that, the kind of statistical training and modeling, the forms of experimentation that need to be done, are not that accessible in, say, other parts of the world. So for an African political scientist trying to write politics on the continent who isn't using formal, you know, high-level quantitative positivist modeling, means you're never really going to get into like the top poli-sci journal, or it's extremely difficult to do so. Another issue there is, you know, what kinds of topics tend to get studied. So when it comes to Africanist political science, so much of it is about ethnicity, about violence, and about elections, which reinforces that these are the important things that the important categories at work in how we study politics. You're more likely to get studied if you, or to get published if you're doing, say, comparative work or mid-range theory with a level of generalizability, as opposed to issues that are much more, say, localized. Then, of course, there's the issue of language. So I think that there is an interesting way of thinking about the traditions of social sciences in the West, what was considered to be a high level of science and why, where that was mapped onto, and how the top journals have come to embed themselves, and also how their demands and expectations of what kind of work counts is, or does or does not discount scholarship produced from Africa.
Wow, thank you for laying out the complexity of that so concisely. So there's a lot there, but I think it's, yeah, really, really important. So a question here from Michaela, which is very closely linked to the title of the talk today. A lot of scholarship has been written by white African scholars, especially in South Africa, for example. I'm curious what your position is on their positionality in the discussion of race in African studies, especially in contrast to white American or British scholars.
I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. And I think that there are people, and there are people on this very call, I think, who would be quite well placed to give a fuller or more in-depth take on that. I mean, yeah, let me hold off on answering that, because talking as a Zimbabwean about South Africans is always complicated, than talking particularly about white South Africans. It's very, very uneasy territory for me.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. So we haven't got any more questions, but I've got questions. And since I'm the host, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask them, if that's okay. So there's sort of two areas that I've been working in that I'd love to get your perspective on. The first one is on participatory research approaches. So participatory research approaches are often held up as a much more ethical way of white scholars from high income countries doing research in low and middle income countries, and that it's much less extractive, and it goes some way to equalizing the uneven power dynamics between researchers and participants. And I just wonder, from your perspective and within the context of this conversation, do you have any opinions on this?
So I've not done that kind of work before, and nor is it something that I've kind of tracked closely, though I am aware of the kind of principles and ideas that you're describing. And maybe that is something to explore kind of in its own right, because I think, that it can be a bit Janus-faced, that there's a way that, like, participatory research, can sound a bit like community engagement, or community participation, or stakeholder interest, whatever, a whole array of euphemisms that exist and that span development practice as well as development research, that are a nod to, or maybe a nod is putting it too dismissively, but are essentially trying to acknowledge the need or pursue the need, at least ideationally, of kind of collaboration in a more ethical way. But I'm never really sure how well that pans out without, I guess, more material change and more material transfer of resources. And, so for instance, I guess maybe to give you an example, I'm thinking a little bit here of the work of the anthropologist Joanna Crane, who's done an ethnography, or did an ethnography of scientific collaborations in Uganda between North American and British institutions working on HIV in that country. And why I like this example is that a lot of scientific, because she sits with a lot of the awkwardness of these interactions. So a lot of scientific collaboration to work, and to you're going to need local scientists and researchers. You need access to clinical facilities and laboratories. You need patients, and the bureaucratic kind of layering of how you ethically clear this work, demands not only forms of consent, but forms of participation. And yet I think what Crane's work sort of captures is a lot of the slight disgruntlement that happens in these partnerships, and the sense that many of the African scientists that she's interviewed feel a bit kind of beholden to these models of research, where the only way you get that grant income, the only way you can start to develop more ambitious research facilities on the ground, is by going along with the latest trend in global health research that's coming from the outside. So there was a time, for instance, in the mid-90s where HIV in Africa was casually dismissed as a death sentence, and antiretroviral drugs was something that was supposed to be used in the West. And then this fashion came for, like, in global health, we got to do research in like resource poor or resource limited settings, and we've got to make it participatory, and we've got to build up African science. But yet, like, the guiding logic, that the tide that's sort of shaping that is still coming from the outside. And certainly, like, if we were to talk to our colleagues at the Wellcome and KEMRI medical research collaboration in Kenya, there's been an intense kind of reckoning with how scientific collaboration works, and about the reach and the limits of what participation is. So I know that's a slightly, adjacent answer to your question, but I think that but I think it's by analogy kind of useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So we've had a couple of comments from John O, if I'm saying that right, sorry, who says perhaps the BEIA's grant for bringing research home, dissemination grants for postdoctoral scholars, which funds scholars return to the site of their research to present and discuss their findings to the community with whom they worked, are one example of a positive step in a good direction, one that may somewhat ameliorate the trend for extractive scholarship. These are not explicitly targeted at white Western scholars, but that's my assumption. And they also say that the project that I'm attached to has a funding pot for open access articles, but only if the articles are co-authored with at least one scholar from one of our partner institutions in Africa. I don't know if such a position creates its own critiques, but the intention is also to redress imbalances in the academy. Do you have any response to that?
Not a full one. I will say that I have joined the BIA's governing council as a trust member, partly with the intention of trying to, participate in the mechanism of holding the BIA to account and hopefully trying to, advance a more kind of equitable and ethical model of research. So I haven't yet sat in on a council meeting, but this is at least an attempt that I'm making to be part of that process.
Great, that's great to hear. So one more question from Marina. What do you think about the influence of Western academia into stratifying academia in African countries, such as universities popular for cooperation with Western countries versus not, but also creating hierarchies within scholars, those who are well connected to top Western universities versus others?
Oh, it's a great question. Again, difficult to answer in the fullness that it deserves. One immediate thought that comes to mind that might be kind of useful for the audience is, I think it was in 1996, Thandika Mkandawire, the late, great Thandika Mkandawire, gave the Abiola Distinguished Lecture for the African Studies Association in the US. And his talk was all oriented on the tensions and fractures between Western scholars and African scholars in the social sciences. And part of what he was getting at, I mean, it's quite sweeping. So he covers everything from agenda setting, intellectual trends, but also how gatekeeping works and thinking about how African institutions. So, in the talk, I talked about that kind of continental tradition of Pan-African scholarship, how that kind of collides with North Atlantic traditions. And I think he just kind of spells out where a lot of the problems lie. And so, obviously, a lot's moved on since then, yet it's remarkable how this, paper that was then published in 1996 still mirrors so much of what I think is happening now. And I think that this idea of like stratifying is a really key issue, right? Which is to say that I kind of feel that there's a lot of, there's a lot of contingency in, or how do I phrase this? When I meet white scholars or scholars from Western Europe and North America who are working on Africa, and you kind of try to do a little bit of their educational or intellectual biographies. How did you end up, working on the particular country that you're interested in? It seems to me that a lot of it's quite almost arbitrary and contingent, and therefore subject to the kind of structural fluctuations of, who their professor was at a given time, which country was accessible, what accessible means, and those kind of stratifications and hierarchies play a big part of that. And so then there's a lot of reproduction, a lot of social reproduction in that model, which of course is not to target the blame at the individuals, but it is to sort of say, well, if we take a step back from it, if you're an African scholar, working on, Chad or Gabon, the chance of you being in Oxford is very, very low. But if you're working like a former colony where these established links, then that reproduces itself, and those hierarchies have a way of just going on and on and on. So I guess maybe what I'm saying is it's useful to read the work of someone like Mkandawire speaking after 10 years the head of a major social science research institute in Africa and look at the problems that he identifies. Then it's also useful thinking about how those of us who become researchers consciously and passively receive and reproduce these kinds of hierarchies and stratifications.
Great, thank you. So we've just got 2 minutes left, and I feel like the conversation today there's been a lot of shared experiences of things that are sort of working, but then there's been a huge discussion on the challenges and the structural barriers to change. And I thought it might be quite nice if we could perhaps end on something quite hopeful. And I wonder if perhaps you'd like to say something in closing that can leave us all with a sense of hope that there is hope.
So I think, okay, so I want to say something sincere here. I feel like one of the challenges for me in trying to write the book that I'm working on has meant sitting with and confronting history in all its ugliness, and trying to do the kind of uncomfortable self-examination and probing and reflection with things that are just a lot easier to ignore, diminish, sweep aside, or rush past, to feel like, okay, I have a sense of the problem, but let's quickly move on to the next thing. And I think taking that analogy from this personal journey perhaps is instructive for a wider social process of reckoning with fraught and difficult histories. So I think one of the things, looking just specifically at the history of African studies, you know, when we start to appreciate how cyclical some of the debates and concerns we have, when we can start to put things into their fullest context, we can perhaps lend a bit more weight to that history and pull it together, and not just be stuck in like endlessly repeating time. And I think that is something that we have available to us. You know, everything that I've talked about and cited today is not from my primary research as such. This is all things that exist out there in the world, whether it's Pledge or Mukandawire or Mama or whoever else. You know, there are so many people who've been thinking about the legacies of what the social sciences are and how they might change. And so I think for me, the hope lies in that we have a lot of the tools already available to us. What we need now is the courage.
Thank you so much. What an amazing note to end on. I'm sure I'm joined by everyone in the room when I say we wish you the best of luck finishing your book, and we look forward to seeing you soon after you finish your year away.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.